All right, guys, today's video is about culling deer. Does it work? If it does work, how often do I need to shoot deer? What rules do I need to enforce? If it doesn't work, then why am I doing this? Is there any point into shooting deer that are inferior? And we'll explain a little bit of that here in this video. So I'm going to tell you right off the bat, I am not in the camp that culling deer works. Yeah, it may feel good to take out a deer that you feel that is not meeting your qualifications, and that way you feel better about your local genetic herd versus, a herd that's over there by those mountains. You're temporarily maybe solving a solution and giving a different buck a different chance to breed a doe that could be a bigger buck. But let's get into a deeper dive on why I believe it doesn't work. So deer management systems are on a bell curve, whether you realize this or not. I hinted at that in the other video when I talked about down here at the bottom is inferior deer. And then when you have your management program, whether you have a lot of land or not a lot of land, you climb up the bell curve, and then when you reach peak, that is what your average buck looks like. So is your average deer a 140? Is your average deer a 150? Generally, most people are probably not going to say it's above that mark. Then, once you cross the threshold of the average deer, that's where the exceptional deer, your booners, kick in. But if you notice, the bell curve goes back down steeply because there's not as many good bucks as there are your average deer. You got to remember, you have exceptional versus poor deer. That's where your average lands. And that's where the top of your bell curve is based on your management system. Now, can you affect the bell curve with better deer management? Yes, you can. But that means the peak of your bell curve could move to 160 instead of 130. And then your exceptional deer could still be on the steep end, but it may not be quite as steep as a bell curve. If you can try to flatten the bell curve out more, that's where you notice a big difference in your deer herd in general. So what happens if you got these big aspirations of Boone and Crockett deer, and you start your management program and you see maybe, I'm just doing this as an example, one or two deer that might qualify for that Boone and Crockett score, but the rest of them are way behind. They look terrible. Maybe a buck's got a really goofy looking side. He has maybe one antler. Maybe he's got a straight up spike on one side. Does that deer need to be culled? And I would tell you, unless you know the true answer to that, I probably would say no to that. And here's why. If you take the deer that has, let's say, the one spike on one side, but the other side looks really impressive. I mean, if the other side had matched, you're talking a buck that could have been a booner. But why does he have that 1 point on one side? There's a number of factors that could cause that, and it may not be genetic. One, the deer was severely injured somewhere on the, excuse me. Sorry about that. If the deer is severely injured, it may be an injury that the deer will never recover from. It could be a cracked skull plate, a fractured skull plate, something to do with the pedicle could be damaged. Maybe there is a severe body injury somewhere on the deer. But here's another one people don't think about on deer that look like that, and that is a bacterial infection. Deer don't necessarily have to have a fractured skull to have a bacterial infection. And the name of the bacteria slips my mind right now, but it's common in every type of deer. Every deer has this bacteria. But why is it only affecting a handful of deer and not the others? Does that deer show a genetic weakness. I'm in the camp it doesn't, because there's actually a different strand of that same bacteria that is more aggressive at eating bone. That's what that bacteria does. It can eat bone. But when deer, that normal strand of bacteria doesn't have enough capacity to damage a buck. So maybe when it gets really old and its self-defenses can't activate as good as they used to, you might see it then. But the bacteria can't harm the deer in all reality. It might be such a small, tiny amount that it doesn't affect the antler at all, or it could be just enough of an effect to make it look one side small, one side large. And then the severe effect is the straight up spike and the normal looking side. But that deer may throw some really impressive young bucks. So if you shoot that deer, you took out a good breeding buck, whether you realize it or not. So that bacteria, that's that really strong strand, eats away at that pedicle. And eventually it can get into the brain of the deer and kill it. It becomes a brain abscess when it finds a crack that it can get into, and it will destroy the deer's brain. So that's what you have to watch out for on bucks with different antler deformities. Now, what about culling deer? Hey, if I shoot 2 or 3 a year that I think are bad, am I doing the right thing? Well, I'm not going to tell people to stop shooting deer. If I saw a buck that I know that's not meeting my qualifications, I'm still going to shoot it, but it's not going to change the overall outcome of my deer herd. At least there's not been any evidence to support that. There's also outside factors that come into culling deer. So deer travel large distances, at least some of them do, some of them don't. We call those roamers. Roamers are the outside influence of your genetic pool. So if I have a buck come off that mountain over there, which I have, I call that deer a roaming deer. He has a higher chance of having a different genetic than my deer here. And that will help revive some of my genetics. But at the same time, if it's a buck that is inferior, he could come back in and downgrade my genetics again. So if I shot a buck that I thought was inferior, you're happy you took him out, and then here comes another buck from outside influences, and you're starting all over again. So you could keep shooting, and the cycle will not stop as long as you have outside influences. The only way that you're going to change that scenario is by high fencing your property and culling every deer you see that's bad. And that way your genetic can't get out. And then eventually, though, you're going to make that genetic run out of steam, and it's going to go downhill. So that's why I'm in the camp of culling does not work. But don't stop shooting deer that you think are inferior. I have lofty goals of having a booner here one day. I've done it before, and I think I can do it again. And now that my soil's in better shape, that should help my odds of at least 1 or 2 of these young bucks becoming some studs down the road. Here's the other factor. If your management program is suffering because of poor soil, this is the best example. I can tell you that this ground is not going to produce a good buck that you want. So if you're leaving your soil in this type of condition and you're trying to grow these big trophy deer, you're probably going to be highly disappointed that you're not seeing more trophies than what you are. Can you get a few good ones? Yes, you can, if you plant in bulk. But it's going to, ground like this is just not going to help you out a lot. You can't have this many shortages and think that you're getting the best genetic return out of your buck. That is not going to work. And you can see here, I added fertilizer in here to the tune of 20 pounds trying to fix this ground up. Matter of fact, this ground has degraded because it's my pumpkin patch, and pumpkins take up potassium. So my potassium levels have dropped. My trace minerals are falling off a cliff right now. There's major problems with this soil. It's actually worse than my food plot is. Far worse than my food plot. So if I grow a giant pumpkin, I can put it in my food plot and get a bigger pumpkin right now. This is the same problem that occurs with deer and trying to determine whether you need to cull or not. I also want to use Poser as a great example. Poser was not a Boone and Crockett deer, but man alive, he had good mass. That's the type of genetic I want. Good mass. I want tine height, but Poser didn't really qualify in the tine height department. I would say he was pretty much on the average end as far as the deer that are around here. He might have actually been an inch or two shorter than some of the average deer. He was really close to being in that zone. But his antlers, if you go back and look at that picture of him where he's laying there, where he's been harvested, his antlers are screaming at me that he did not get all the nutrition he needed. There's hardly any bumps on his antlers. They're very smooth. And there's also a lot of blades on his G2s and even blades on the G3s that shows like he is trying to express far more points than what he actually grew. And if that little kicker at his base is an inch long, he managed to grow 10 points on a poor nutrition. He only got help from me when he was here during the early winter and even up to about the end of March. He would stay here that long and then he would disappear again. And I know for a fact he was hanging out somewhere over in there. Whether it was 1, 2, or 3 or 4 miles away, I don't know. I just know it was down that direction somewhere, and the people down there generally don't have food plots out. They're not fixing soil, and that deer is just living off what he can. If that deer had stayed here, I guarantee you his antlers would have been way more impressive, and you would have said, that's the type of deer I want to keep. But if you're after booners, you would have culled that buck thinking that he is the genetically inferior buck for what you want. Also, culling takes on different meanings depending on what type of program you are running. If you're looking for trophy deer, I consider trophy deer the Boone and Crockett minimum, which is around 165. And then a non-typical, I think, is around 180. I have to go back and double check that. But I want a program that manages deer like that and larger. I have to make sure I'm doing everything right before I start culling deer. Now, the other thing is points play a factor into culling bucks. So if I'm doing the trophy system and I see an 8-point buck that's 5 or 6 years old, I pretty much have a good feeling that deer most likely will not add a point or two. He may stay where he's at the rest of his life. So point wise, that buck would be genetically inferior and they are shot out. So people are wanting deer that produce double-digit points to increase the odds of making it a Boone and Crockett deer. So I want to keep deer that are in that 9, 10 plus point range in order to try to get more genetic expression out of those deer. Non-typical deer are, those deer can vary wildly. There's no set rule to what non-typicals can be for me. Non-typicals can occur through injuries. Like you hear these cars going by the road here. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to film over here. You can constantly hear vehicles going by. Deer's going to get hit by a car at some point. And if it survives, it will have a very funky antler the following season. It may take 1 to 2 years to get rid of that, or it may be that way the rest of his life. Other influences can be sickness. EHD can cause a lot of non-typicals the following year, and you think, wow, man, my management plan's blowing up. I've got all these crazy character points, and then the next year they're gone. They're back to looking typical again. So culling is a very tricky situation to be in. I'm not telling people not to shoot deer that are under your goals. In my opinion, I think a good balance is to take at least 1 or 2 of those deer that are not genetically up to snuff and focus on your last tag being your ultimate buck. But depending on your state rules, if you're only allowed 1 buck, are you willing to shoot it yourself? Have somebody else come and do it? You've got a choice to make on that if you're limited to just 1 buck. Here I'm allowed 2. So I can shoot 1 bad one and I can shoot 1 good one. Now the other influence here is does. Genetic problems can come from does. I would rather harvest a doe than I would an inferior buck. Does can be responsible for 60 to 70% of a buck's antler development. If that doe is throwing inferior bucks, how are you going to know that? I mean, I'm fortunate enough where my deer herd is small enough I can keep track of something like that. And all my does throw good deer from what I've seen so far. I haven't really seen a genetically inferior deer. Matter of fact, they've been steadily improving, except for some of the points vary wildly. But other than that, the bodies are looking better, and better. So the does could be your big problem. How are you going to figure out which doe it is? When you're in the woods, they all look the same, unless it's a small doe versus a big doe. So you're playing basically Russian roulette trying to figure out which doe it is. Unless she's got a special mark on her body, there's no way you're going to figure it out. So you would need to up your doe harvest, trying to up the odds that you can get that doe. But at the same time, you're also shooting does that could throw great deer. And this is also another cycle into breeding for the pen raised people that do this, the breeding cycles and chart deer. Even the best breeders in the world have deer that they don't consider breeder bucks. Breeder bucks are those exceptional growing monsters that are over 400 and something inches to people. So even with the best management system, you're still going to get deer that do not meet your criteria. And that doesn't mean you're doing a bad job. But the more of the good bucks you see, the better job you are on your management system as far as your soil, nutrition, food needs. Those will help determine how your bell curve will shape out. There's also some other factors here that people don't think about when I'm talking about the deer breeding side of things. A buck that is massive, and I'm talking, let's say you got this once in a lifetime 200-inch deer on your property. What if that deer has bred every doe you got, and you allow those fawns to grow to ripe old ages and they can't even match him? Let's say they only get to 150 or 140 range. What in the world happened? That means that big buck you shot is probably not throwing good, strong fawns. So you shot a buck that is genetically awesome looking, but he may shoot out terrible offspring. Where a buck that is funky looking may shoot out some of the best genetic looking bucks on your property. It's hard to tell. It is impossible to tell what is going to happen. You can't tell deer are injured. You can't tell deer sick unless he's really exhibiting symptoms of something major wrong with him. You can't stop deer from breeding certain does. Unless you're a pen breeder, you can control it that way. But out in the wild, it's whoever gets there first, or whoever wins the fight, or in some cases, who's the sneakiest while the others are fighting. So you have to be aware that no matter what you do, there's always going to be that, quote, cull buck in your herd. And it's not going to change. You could shoot one every year and there'll be somebody else to take its place. And there is a wildlife biologist. I've studied under Grant Williams before many times. He is a fantastic deer manager. There's also another guy that was partnered with him, and I can't remember his name at one point, or at least they had worked together for some time. And he is also in the same camp that culling doesn't work. I will post that link to the interview in the community channel, and I probably will add a poll. State your opinion. Do you think it does work, or does it not? I mean, I'm not going to down anybody that says yes or no. That is your choice. But when you hear the interview, I think it will open your eyes to what really goes on and why it doesn't work. But still shoot those deer that are not meeting your marks. All right, guys. Hope this helps. My voice is about dead. I am really dehydrated. Didn't drink enough water today. But I will bring more on this later as I try to get this pumpkin patch area here serviceable for deer and my pumpkins. I mean, the clover looks good. It's hiding a few problems, but this is really showing it right here. All right, guys, have a good one.